The sun was falling behind the mesas, painting the desert in strokes of gold and crimson. Wind moved softly through the tall grass, carrying the faint scent of sage and smoke. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Coyote called, long and lonely, a sound that belonged to the land long before men carved fences through it. She sat there beside him, her dress torn at the sleeve, her breath still uneven from the long ride. For hours neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy, alive, full of words they were too afraid to say. She looked at him, the Apache, his skin bronzed by the sun. His hair dark as the shadows gathering at dusk, a single braid falling over his shoulder. The mark on his arm caught the fading light, an old tribal symbol inked deep into his flesh, a reminder of blood and duty. He didn't move, didn't look her way, yet she felt the weight of his presence more than the ground beneath her feet. There was a peace around him, the kind that came from surviving storms no one else could stand in. And yet behind that calm, she could sense something burning. A battle he never stopped fighting. They had met when neither believed in mercy. The memory of that first day still haunted her like a fever dream. She had been lost, a white woman alone in the desert, her horse gone, her lips cracked from thirst. He had found her near the riverbed, half conscious, holding a broken canteen. She had heard stories about his kind, wild, savage, heartless, but when he offered her water, his hands trembled. It was not fear. It was restraint. He could have left her, but he didn't. And from that moment, her life no longer belonged to the world she came from. He brought her to a small camp hidden in the canyon, a place where the wind whispered through the stones like prayer. She stayed because there was nowhere else to go. Days turned into weeks, and she began to see the truth in the eyes of those people, not the savages the townsfolk spoke of, but families who loved, who buried their dead, who taught their children to ride before they could walk. Still, she was an outsider, and the Apache women kept their distance. Only he spoke to her, few words at first, short as flint sparks. But each one struck something deep inside her. He called her the woman who listens. Because she never interrupted, never mocked, never ran. She didn't know his name until much later. To her, he was simply him. The one who stood watch when others slept. The one who cut his hand when he prayed to his ancestors. The one who looked at her like she was something he wasn't supposed to want. As the weeks passed, the desert became her teacher. She learned the paths of the stars, how to read the wind, how to move without leaving prints. She also learned how lonely the heart could be when it wanted what it shouldn't. At night, she would lie awake and listen to the sound of drums echoing from the distance, each beat carrying a memory she didn't understand. There were times he sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames, and she could feel his silence reach her. It frightened her how much she began to need it. Then came the night that changed everything. The soldiers came without warning, column of dust and rifles marching toward the canyon. They burned what they couldn't take, shouting orders in a language that didn't belong to the land. She saw the Apache women run, clutching their children. She saw men fall in the smoke. And she saw him standing between her and the soldiers, arrows flying past his head. He didn't call her name, didn't tell her to run. He just looked at her once and she understood. It was the look of a man who would rather die than see her chained again. They fled through the canyons until their lungs burned. The night swallowed the trail behind them. When they finally stopped near a ridge, she turned to him, trembling, her dress covered in dust and blood. "Why did you save me?" she asked. His answer came in the faintest whisper. "Because you looked at me as if I were human." That night, they didn't sleep. The fire between them was small, but the silence grew wide and restless. She watched his face as the flames flickered, strong, scarred, beautiful in a way that didn't belong to any world she knew. The words she wanted to say burned in her throat, but she bit them back, afraid of what they might bring. Now, sitting beside him in the golden field, she felt the weight of every unspoken truth pressing against her heart. The sun was almost gone, and shadows stretched long across the plain. She reached out, hesitated, then let her hand rest on his arm. He didn't pull away. She could feel the pulse beneath his skin, steady, warm, alive. And for a moment, everything around them disappeared. The war, the fear, The world that said they could never belong to each other, none of it mattered. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. I can't pretend. I love you. The words hung in the air, fragile as smoke. He turned to her slowly, and for the first time she saw the storm in his eyes. It wasn't a surprise, it was sorrow. The kind that came from knowing love too late, from losing everything once before and fearing it again. His gaze locked with hers, and though he said nothing, it spoke louder than any words could. It told her that he felt the same, that he had loved her from the moment he first saw her dying under the desert sun, that he had fought it every day since, and that no prayer or silence could ever bury what burned between them. But love in their world was a dangerous thing. The river had a memory, and the wind carried voices that warned of what could not be. Far in the distance, drums began again, faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat calling from the past. His jaw tightened. He looked toward the horizon where dark clouds were gathering over the mesas. They will come for us, he said. She shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. Then let them. I don't care. He stood, shoulders tense, scanning the distance. You should, he said quietly. Because I do. The last light of day slipped away, and with it, the fragile peace they had found. Horses neighed somewhere far off, and she felt the air grow colder. He reached down, took her hand once, firm, steady, as if memorizing the shape of it, then let go. If they find us together, they'll kill you first, he said. His voice barely more than breath. She rose to her feet, heart pounding, the taste of dust and fear in her mouth. Then what are you going to do? She asked. He turned to her, the fading light carving his face into shadow and flame. I'll do what I was born to do, he said. Fight. And before she could speak again, before she could tell him that love was worth any death, he was already walking away, toward the ridge, toward the sound of drums and destiny. The wind lifted her hair, carrying his scent, the smoke of cedar and ash. She wanted to call out, to stop him, to beg him not to leave. But something in his gaze when he turned one last time kept her silent. It was the look of a man who knew that some love stories weren't written to end. They were written to survive. The night fell over the plains, and the first thunder rolled in the distance. The thunder rolled again. Low and far, like the growl of something ancient waking beneath the earth. She stood there long after he had gone, her hand still warm where he had held it. The field swayed with the night wind, whispering secrets she couldn't understand. She had never felt so alone, and yet something in her chest refused to break. He had walked into danger, and she knew that if he didn't return, her world would end before morning. She found herself moving toward the small camp they had built among the rocks. The fire was dying, the embers glowing, faint and tired. She sat beside it, hugging her knees, trying to find comfort in the memory of his voice. He had told her once that every storm was a test, not of strength but of heart. If you face it with fear, he said, you die twice. She tried to believe that now, before she had met him. She had belonged to another life, one made of fences, rules, and whispers. Her father had owned land near the Santa Fe Trail, a small ranch with more debt than cattle. She had been promised to a man she didn't love, a traitor who looked at her the way one looks at property. When she refused to marry him, her father had said she'd ruin them all. So she had run. She thought she'd find freedom on the open road, but freedom in the frontier came with a price. It was on her third day alone that she met the desert and death face to face. That was when the Apache found her. He had been scouting ahead of his tribe, following the tracks of soldiers who had taken horses from their village. He wasn't supposed to stop, but when he saw her collapse near the riverbed, her skin burned from the sun. Something in him refused to ride past. He poured water into her mouth with steady hands and watched her breathe again. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was him, tall, silent, eyes sharp as obsidian, but full of an unfamiliar kindness. The journey to his camp had been quiet. She rode behind him, clutching the leather strap of the saddle, her fingers brushing the long braid that hung down his back. He didn't look at her, not once, and yet she felt seen in a way she never had before. The camp lay deep in the canyon, hidden among red rocks and wild juniper trees. The people there watched her with wary eyes, but they obeyed him. He told them she was lost, and that was enough. The first nights were the hardest. The women whispered about her, the children hid, and the men stared with suspicion. She slept apart, wrapped in an old blanket, dreaming of voices that spoke in languages she couldn't understand. Yet every morning she found food waiting for her, a bowl of roasted corn, dried meat, a small skin of water. He never said it was from him, but she knew. One evening, when the air turned cool and the campfires burned low, she saw him sitting on a rock, carving something with a bone knife. She approached carefully, afraid of interrupting, but he looked up and gestured for her to sit. He was shaping a small piece of wood, a bird with outstretched wings. "Why a bird?" she asked softly. He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "Because birds remember the way home, even when the sky changes." She didn't know what he meant, but his words stayed with her. Days passed, and the gap between them began to close. She started helping the women gather roots, learning their ways, their songs, their rhythm with the earth. They began to trust her. Though they still called her the White One, he, however, called her by a word she would never forget, Noah. Later, she learned it meant heart. But peace was never meant to last in those lands. The soldiers were moving again, building forts, claiming territory that wasn't theirs. Rumors spread that the Apache had raided a wagon train near Tucson. In truth, it wasn't his tribe, but the army didn't care. They saw no difference between one village and another. When the attack came, it was sudden and merciless. The soldiers stormed the canyon before dawn, guns flashing in the dark. She woke to the sound of screams and horses. By the time she reached the ridge, the air was thick with smoke and gunfire. He found her there, clutching a child who had lost his mother. "You must go," he told her. She shook her head, crying, "I won't leave you." He grabbed her wrist, his voice steady but fierce. "If you stay, you'll die." She saw the fear in his eyes, not for himself but for her, and it broke something inside her. He led her through a narrow path between the rocks, pushing her ahead until the noise faded behind them. That was the last time she saw her old life burning. Now, under the cover of night, the memory of that fire still burned in her mind. She wondered if the others had survived, if the child lived, if the world would ever let them rest. The sound of distant drums drifted on the wind again, and her heart sank. She didn't know if it was his people calling him home, or another band hunting them both. She rose, pacing around the campfire. Every shadow seemed alive. Every gust of wind carried the echo of hooves. She remembered the last thing he said before leaving. "They will come for us." But who were they? Soldiers? His own people? The thought twisted in her chest. Was she the reason he was hunted? Was love the crime they would both pay for? The night deepened, the moon rising pale and cold above the plains. She wrapped herself in his blanket, breathing in the faint scent of smoke and leather. Her fingers found the small wooden bird he had carved, now hanging from a string near her bedroll. She held it close to her heart as if it could keep her safe. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, and another answered. Hours passed before she heard the sound she feared most, the cry of an eagle, followed by a sharp whistle. It was a signal. Her heart leaped into her throat. She crouched low, staring into the dark. Then she saw him. He was walking toward her, his figure outlined by the silver light, his chest bare, his hair loose in the wind. Relief flooded through her. But it vanished when she saw the blood on his shoulder. He sank to his knees near the fire, breathing hard. She rushed to him, pressing her hands against the wound. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling. He shook his head. "It's nothing." But the blood kept coming. She tore a piece from her dress, wrapping it tightly around his arm. "Who did this?" she asked. He looked at her, his jaw set. "Soldiers. They followed the trail. They'll be here by dawn." Fear rippled through her. "Then we have to leave." He met her eyes, silent for a long moment. "There's no place to run," he said. "Not anymore." She felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Then we fight," she whispered. He almost smiled, almost then touched her cheek with the back of his hand. You've got more fire than most warriors I know. She didn't understand how calm he could be while the world was falling apart around them. Maybe it was faith. Maybe it was the desert itself that made men like him. He rose slowly, scanning the horizon. The clouds were thick now, covering the moon. If they find us, he said, promise me you'll hide until it's over. She shook her head again. I won't promise what I can't do. He turned toward her, the firelight dancing in his eyes. You don't understand, he said softly. If they take you, they'll use you to break me. Those words silenced her. She wanted to speak, to tell him that nothing could break what they had, but the weight of his voice left her still. He stepped closer, his breath warm against her hair. If I fall, don't look back. She swallowed hard. And if you don't come back? She asked. He hesitated, then said, then remember me in the wind. The storm was moving closer now. Lightning flashed across the plain, lighting up the distant ridge. She could see the faint shimmer of movement. Riders. They were coming. He tightened the strap of his knife, adjusted the bow on his back, and turned to face the wind. She wanted to stop him, to make him stay, but her voice wouldn't come. He looked at her one last time, that same look, full of fire and sorrow, and she knew that whatever was about to happen would change everything, as he disappeared into the darkness. The thunder rolled again, shaking the ground beneath her. She clutched the wooden bird in her hand and whispered a prayer she didn't know the words to. Somewhere ahead, she heard the cry of a hawk, his signal, and then the sound of rifles breaking the silence of the night. The battle had begun, and she could only wait, caught between love and the storm. The night tore open with gunfire. The echo of shots cracked across the plains, mingling with the roar of thunder. She ducked behind the rocks, heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. Every flash of lightning showed shadows moving, soldiers spreading across the ridge, their rifles glinting like fangs in the stormlight. Somewhere out there, he was fighting alone, against men who carried orders written in hatred. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder. She could almost hear his arrows whistling through the dark. Rain began to fall thin at first, then heavy, soaking the ground. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. She had promised herself she wouldn't be a burden to him, but sitting there, helpless and trembling, she realized how fragile that promise was. She wanted to run to him, to stand beside him no matter what came. But she remembered his words, "If I fall, don't look back." So she waited. Her mind caught between faith and fear. Lightning split the sky again, and in that brief flash, she saw two figures locked in a struggle near the river. She couldn't tell who was who, but one fell, and her breath caught. She crawled forward through the mud, ignoring the sting of stones on her knees, until she reached the edge of the ridge. The rain blurred everything, turning the world into a smear of fire and smoke. She could hear the soldiers shouting orders, their voices cold and certain. They were closing in. Below, the Apache fought like the storm itself, fierce, untamed, unwilling to yield. He moved through the chaos with the grace of a spirit born from the desert. But there were too many of them. The soldiers had torches now, flames dancing against the rain, turning the battlefield into a wild blur of light and shadow. She saw him fall to one knee, clutching his shoulder where a bullet had grazed him. Her heart screamed, but her voice didn't rise. She knew if she called out, it would end both their lives. Then a sudden explosion of light came from behind the soldiers. A second group had appeared. For a moment, confusion spread among the ranks. It wasn't his people this time, but a small band of Apaches from a neighboring tribe. She recognized one of the faces, a woman named Taya, fierce and proud, who had never trusted her. They must have come after hearing the fight. The soldiers turned their fire toward them, and chaos swallowed the night. Taking advantage of the distraction, she crawled down the slope, slipping and sliding through the wet clay until she reached the lower plain. She could barely see, but she followed the trail of blood that the rain hadn't yet washed away. Each drop pulled her forward, each heartbeat urging her faster. When she finally found him, he was leaning against a rock, breathing hard, his bow broken beside him. "You shouldn't be here," he said through clenched teeth. She dropped to her knees, pressing her hands against his wound. "And you shouldn't be dying," she said, her voice breaking. He gave a faint smile. "It takes more than a bullet to kill me." She tore another strip from her dress and tied it tight around his arm. The rain had washed the blood away from his face, but his eyes, those dark, unflinching eyes, still burned with the same fire. The sound of hooves thundered in the distance. The soldiers were regrouping. She looked around desperately, searching for a way out. To the east, the land dropped into a ravine, the water below swollen from the storm. "We have to move," she said. He nodded weakly, pushing himself up with one hand. "Help me to the ridge," he said. She slipped her arm under his shoulder, and together they stumbled through the rain, the ground sinking under their feet. Each step felt heavier than the last. Behind them, the fight raged on, screams, shots, the clash of steel on stone. The rain muffled it all, turning war into a haunting rhythm. When they reached the edge of the ravine, she stopped. The drop was steep, but the water below offered the only chance of escape. He looked down, then back at her. "If we jump, the current will take us," he said. "If we stay, they'll find us." She hesitated, gripping his arm. "Can you swim?" His answer came as a whisper. "If I must." Without another word, they jumped. The water hit them like stone. For a moment, she couldn't tell which way was up. The current dragged her under, spinning her through darkness and cold. She reached out blindly until her fingers brushed his hand. He pulled her toward him, kicking hard against the current until they broke the surface. She gasped, coughing, her lungs burning. The rain still fell, mixing with the river, but she could see the faint line of trees ahead. They drifted until the current slowed, finally pulling them to the muddy shore. She collapsed beside him, trembling from the cold. He lay on his back, staring at the sky, his chest rising and falling unevenly. "We made it," she whispered. "For now," he replied. The storm began to fade, leaving behind a heavy silence. The smell of smoke still clung to the air. She turned toward him, brushing wet hair from his face. "What happens now?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, part sadness, part warning. "They won't stop," he said. "The soldiers, my people, none of them will stop until one of us is gone." His words struck her like a stone. "But why? You've done nothing wrong." He laughed softly, a sound with no joy. "To them, love is a sin when it crosses bloodlines. You are the enemy they were taught to hate, and I betrayed everything they believe in." She wanted to argue, to say love wasn't betrayal. But deep down she knew the world wasn't built for truth, only for survival. She thought of her father's ranch, of the men who'd called her foolish for wanting freedom, and realized she had been running from cages all her life. Only now had she found one she was willing to die in. The sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. She could see the outline of the distant mesas glowing faintly pink. He sat up slowly, wincing in pain. "We need to find shelter before the sun rises," he said. "They'll be tracking us." She helped him to his feet, and together they began walking through the wet grass toward a grove of cottonwoods. By the time they reached it, he was barely standing. She made him rest against the trunk of a tree while she searched for firewood. Her hands shook as she gathered the damp sticks, but she refused to give in to fear. When she returned, he was staring off into the distance, lost in thought. "You shouldn't have followed me," he murmured. She knelt beside him. "If I hadn't, you'd be dead by now." He turned his head toward her, his expression softening. "You're not afraid of death?" She smiled faintly. "Not when it means something." He watched her for a long moment, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "You have the heart of a warrior," he said, "but your world will never forgive you for loving me." She looked down, her fingers tightening around the wooden bird still hanging from her neck. "Then let it hate me," she whispered. "I've lived too long pretending to be what they wanted." The wind rustled the leaves above them, carrying with it the scent of rain and smoke. Somewhere far away a hawk cried, a sound of warning. He closed his eyes, listening. "They're coming," he said quietly. "Not soldiers this time. My own." Her blood ran cold. Your people? He nodded. They think I've betrayed them. They'll come to take me back, or to finish what the army started. She stood, heart pounding. Then we have to keep running. He shook his head. No, there's no running from blood. They know the land better than any man alive. They'll track us by the river, by the wind, even by the smoke of our breath. She knelt in front of him, grabbing his hand. Then what do we do? He looked at her, truly looked as if memorizing her face one last time. We wait, he said. Sometimes the only way to fight is to stand still. The sun began to rise, spreading gold across the plains. In the distance, faint shapes moved through the mist. Riders. She could see their feathers catching the light, their silhouettes clear against the horizon. He stood slowly, every movement a silent act of defiance. They are my brothers, he said. But if they see you, they'll show no mercy. She rose beside him, trembling but unyielding. Then they'll have to kill me too. The wind carried the riders' voices closer, the sound low and haunting. He reached for his knife, then stopped, lowering it. If blood is spilled today, he said softly, let it be mine, not yours. She reached for his hand, refusing to let go. No, she whispered. If this is the end, we face it together. The riders emerged through the morning fog, their horses moving in a slow circle around them. The air grew still, the world holding its breath. He stood tall, wounded, but unbroken. The woman beside him refusing to bow, and as the first light touched their faces, the leader of the riders raised his hand, not in greeting, but in judgment, and the story of their love teetered on the edge of war. The sun rose like a slow-burning fire. Bleeding through the fog that clung to the valley, the riders approached in silence, their horses' hooves muffled by the wet earth. She stood beside him, every heartbeat echoing in her chest. The leader's face was stern, carved from years of battle and loss. His dark eyes fixed on the wounded Apache standing before him. The feathers in his hair glistened with dew. A painted handprint marked his chest, a symbol of war. The Apache beside her didn't move. His back was straight, his expression calm but unyielding. The leader dismounted, walking slowly toward them. Each step carried weight, not just of authority, but of betrayal remembered. You were warned, the leader said in their tongue, his voice deep and steady. You were told no white blood would mix with ours. And yet here you stand with her. He didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on the horizon, where the sun had begun to burn through the mist. She couldn't understand the words, but she knew from their tones that danger was closing around them like a tightening noose. The other riders circled wider, forming a ring that left no room for escape. The leader turned his gaze toward her. She felt it sharp, cold, and heavy with judgment. She has no place here, he said, switching to broken English. You bring shame to the spirits. You bring death. Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. I didn't ask for war, she said quietly. Only for him. The leader's eyes narrowed. Then you asked for his grave. He drew a knife from his belt, its blade catching the sunlight. The sound of metal scraping against leather sent a chill through her. The Apache stepped forward then, blocking her from the blade. If blood is to fall, he said, let it be mine. His voice didn't shake. The leader stared at him for a long moment, then sheathed his knife. It will be, he said. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. No one moved. No one breathed. The air itself seemed to wait. Finally, the leader spoke again, his tone softer, but no less dangerous. You broke the law of your ancestors. You turned your back on your people, but we do not kill our own without a trial. You will return with us to face judgment. He looked over his shoulder at the men on horseback. And the woman? One asked. The leader hesitated. Then his voice came cold and final. She does not belong. Her heart seized. She reached for him, but his hand caught hers before she could speak. Don't, he whispered. His grip was strong, his eyes pleading, but calm. Do not fight them. Not now. The riders dismounted, two of them stepping forward to bind his hands. He didn't resist. The rope cut against his wrists, dark blood seeping where the fibers rubbed his skin. She wanted to scream, to throw herself at them, but he shook his head slightly, a warning, a plea. They began to lead him toward the horses. She followed, her breath shallow, her mind spinning. One of the warriors turned and raised his spear in warning. "You will not come," he said. "This is not your fight." She stepped back, but only enough to keep from provoking them. "You can't take him," she said, her voice trembling but fierce. "He saved my life. He saved yours." The leader's face darkened. "He has cursed himself. If you follow, you'll curse him more." They mounted their horses, pulling him up onto one of the saddles. The rope was tied to the lead warrior's reins, so he couldn't escape. She watched helplessly as they began to ride away, the sound of hooves fading with each second. When the last shadow disappeared into the trees, she sank to her knees, her body shaking with anger and grief. The world around her seemed to collapse into silence. The wind no longer moved. The birds no longer sang. She pressed her forehead against the ground, whispering his name into the soil, as if the earth itself might carry it to him. The rain from the night before had left the scent of sage and ash in the air, a scent that reminded her of him. She closed her eyes and let the pain harden into resolve. He had saved her more than once. Now it was her turn. By midday, she was following their trail. The ground was soft, marked with hoof prints and broken branches. Her dress clung to her skin, torn and stained with mud, but she didn't care. She moved like someone who had nothing left to lose. The sun beat down hard and the heat blurred the edges of the horizon. Still, she walked as the afternoon waned. She reached the edge of a ravine and saw smoke rising in the distance, their camp. She crouched low behind the rocks, watching. The riders had gathered near a circle of fires. The leader stood apart, speaking with an older man whose hair was streaked with silver and whose presence seemed to hold command. The Apache, her Apache, was tied to a wooden post at the center of the camp, his arms bound but his head high. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see their anger in every gesture. They were arguing. The older man gestured toward the east, where the soldier's trail might still linger. Perhaps he wanted peace, but the younger warriors shook their heads. Their pride was louder than reason. As the sun dipped low, the camp began to quiet. The men took turns guarding the prisoner, while others prepared for what looked like a ritual. Fires burning brighter, drums beating slow and deep. She understood then that this wasn't just a trial. It was something older, something that could end in death. She waited until darkness fell. Then she crept closer, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The campfire light flickered across the faces of the guards. One of them nodded off, his head sinking lower. She moved silently through the brush, stepping where the shadows were deepest. When she reached the post, he lifted his head, eyes widening as he saw her. "What are you doing?" He whispered. "Taking you home," she said. He shook his head. "You can't. They'll kill you if they see. Then we'll die together," she said. He looked at her with that same gaze, the one that said everything words. She pulled a small knife from her boot, its blade catching the faint light. Her hands trembled as she began to cut the ropes around his wrists. The fibers snapped one by one, slow and quiet, but before she could finish, a shout split the night. One of the guards had seen her. The camp exploded into chaos. Warriors rose to their feet, grabbing weapons, shouting in their language. She grabbed his arm and pulled him free, just as an arrow struck the ground beside them. "Run," he shouted. They sprinted toward the ravine, the air filled with smoke and fury. The drums turned to war cries, and the fire spread behind them. He stumbled once, his wounds slowing him, but she caught him, pulling him along. The earth beneath them shook as horses thundered after them. They reached the edge of the ravine, the same one they had crossed before. The moonlight glimmered on the river below. "It's too far," she said, her voice breaking. He looked back. The riders were almost upon them. He turned to her, his eyes fierce. "You trust me?" She nodded, breathless. "Then jump." Before she could protest, he pulled her close and leaped. The wind tore at their clothes as they fell, crashing into the water below. The river swallowed them whole. The cold burned her lungs, the current dragging her through darkness once again. When they surfaced, she gasped for air, clutching his arm. He coughed, the sound raw but alive. "Keep swimming," he said. The roar of the river drowned out everything else. By the time they reached the shore, the night had turned silent again. They collapsed in the mud, gasping, their bodies bruised and heavy. For a moment there was nothing. No war, no pursuit, just the quiet of survival. But it didn't last. In the distance, torches began to flicker once more. The riders had found the river crossing. Their voices carried through the night, closer every minute. He turned to her, his breath uneven. "They won't stop now," he said. "Not until one of us is gone." She touched his face, trembling. "Then we make them stop." He looked at her, really looked, and she saw it in his eyes. The moment before the storm breaks, the weight of every choice they had made, the truth that love had become a battlefield. He stood, weak but steady, and picked up a fallen spear from the riverbank. The rain had returned, cold and relentless. "Go north," he said. "Find the canyon. There's an old path there. You'll be safe." She shook her head. "Not without you." The sound of hooves grew louder. The light from the torches painted the trees in shades of fire. He turned toward the noise, gripping the spear tight. "You'll have to be," he said quietly. The wind rose. The rain turned to mist, and the first rider broke. Through the trees, she screamed. His name as he stepped forward into the storm, one man. Against a tide of vengeance in the night, swallowed them both in thunder and fire. The storm broke open across the plains. Wind howling through the trees, as if the earth itself cried out for mercy. The rain came down in sheets, washing away blood and footprints alike. She stood frozen at the river's edge, her heart tearing itself apart as the light from torches flickered through the trees. He was out there, standing against them, one man against a dozen, the storm his only witness. Every sound, every clash, every cry, felt like it was echoing inside her. She wanted to run to him, to fight beside him, but her legs wouldn't move. She could only watch the glow of fire and the shadows moving wildly in the downpour. Thunder rolled again, drowning the shouts. She fell to her knees, clutching the wooden bird around her neck until it dug into her skin. Her lips moved in prayer, not to any god she'd known, but to the spirits he had once spoken of, the ones of river and wind and fire. She prayed for his life, for a miracle, for one more chance to see him breathe again. The gunfire stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Only the rain remained, heavy and merciless. She rose slowly, her dress clinging to her skin, and began to move forward. Her feet sank in the mud, her breath caught between sobs and fear. The closer she came, the more she feared what she'd find. When she reached the clearing, the storm had begun to fade. The trees were blackened by smoke, and the ground was littered with broken spears and spent shells. The torches had gone out, their flames drowned by rain. Bodies lay scattered, men from both sides who had given their lives to pride and vengeance. And then she saw him. He was kneeling near the riverbank, his head bowed, his hands gripping the earth as if trying to hold on to life itself. The blood from his shoulder ran dark against the mud. She ran to him, dropping beside him, her hands shaking as she touched his face. His eyes opened slowly, and when he saw her, a faint smile crossed his lips. "You shouldn't have stayed," he whispered. She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You shouldn't have fought alone," he tried to speak but winced from the pain. She pressed her hands against his wound, desperate to stop the bleeding. "Save your strength," she said, her voice breaking. "You're going to live." He looked past her toward the sky where the clouds were parting. "The rain will stop soon," he said softly, "and the land will remember this night." Behind them, one of the surviving riders stirred. It was the leader, wounded but alive. He struggled to stand, his face pale and drawn. She turned to face him, ready to defend the man she loved with whatever strength she had left. But the leader didn't raise his weapon. Instead, he looked at her with something like sorrow. "You love him," he said quietly. "Even after all this?" She nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, more than my own life." The leader looked at the fallen warriors around them, at the river that ran red with their sacrifice. Then go, he said. Take him and leave this place. The spirits have had enough blood. She didn't wait for him to change his mind. With all her strength, she helped the wounded Apache to his feet. They began to walk, step by step, away from the battlefield. The rain had softened into mist, and the air smelled of wet earth and smoke. The leader watched them go until they disappeared into the trees. They walked for hours through the darkness. Following the faint light of dawn, he leaned heavily on her, his breath shallow but steady. She guided him toward a cave she had seen before, hidden behind a curtain of vines. Inside, she laid him down gently, wrapping his wounds with what was left of her dress. His skin was cold, his face pale, but his eyes, those eyes still burned with life. You'll be safe here, she whispered. I'll find water, I'll find food. Just hold on. He reached for her hand, his grip weak but steady. You saved me, he said. She shook her head. You saved me first. He smiled faintly, his gaze drifting toward the light at the cave's edge. The world won't understand us, he said. They never will. Then we'll build one that does, she replied. For a long moment, they said nothing. The only sound was the soft drip of water from the cave walls and the distant murmur of the river. She stayed beside him, holding his hand, feeling the warmth slowly return to his fingers. The storm outside had passed, leaving the land quiet and still. Days went by before he could walk again. She nursed him with what little she could find, roots, berries, rainwater collected in a hollow stone. When the sun finally returned, painting the desert gold, he stood at the mouth of the cave and looked out at the wide, open land. This land has seen too much hate, he said. Too much death. She joined him, resting her head against his shoulder. Then let our love be what's left, she said softly. He turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. If we stay here, they'll come again. My people, the soldiers, someone will always hunt what they don't understand. Then where do we go? She asked. He looked toward the horizon where the mountains met the sky. North, he said. Beyond the mesas there's a valley where the rivers meet. My grandfather once spoke of it, a place untouched by war. So they went. Each day brought new trials, hunger, exhaustion, the threat of discovery, but also a strange peace. They crossed through canyons where the red rocks glowed like fire, through forests where the air was cool and still. At night, they slept beneath the stars, their fingers intertwined, their hearts bound by the silence between them. Sometimes, when she woke before dawn, she'd see him watching the horizon, his expression distant. She knew he carried the weight of his people on his shoulders, the burden of being both warrior and exile. But when he looked at her, that weight seemed to lift, even if only for a moment. Weeks later, they found the valley he had spoken of. It lay hidden between two mountains, green and alive, a small stream cutting through its heart. Birds sang in the trees, and wild horses grazed near the water. It felt untouched, sacred, as if the earth itself had been waiting for them. They built a small shelter near the stream. Nothing more than branches and stones, but it was enough. For the first time since she had met him, there was peace. No soldiers, no drums, no ghosts from the past, only the sound of wind moving through the grass. One evening, as the sun set, he handed her something wrapped in cloth. When she opened it, she found the wooden bird he had carved long ago, now worn smooth from his hands. I thought it was lost. She whispered. He smiled. It found its way back, like we did. She held it close, her eyes shining. What does it mean now? He looked toward the setting sun, his face calm. It means the sky changes, he said, but love remembers the way home. They stood there until the last light faded, their shadows blending with the earth. Years passed quietly in that hidden valley. Sometimes she would see smoke far off in the distance, the world still fighting its wars, but it no longer reached them. Their days were simple, their hearts steady. The wounds of that night became scars, and the scars became stories whispered to the wind. When she grew older, she would walk to the river's edge and watch the water flow, remembering the night it carried them both from death into life. Sometimes she thought of the leader who had spared them, wondering if he too had found peace. Sometimes she thought of the town she'd left behind and the father who never knew where she'd gone. But mostly, she thought of him, the man who had taught her that love could bloom even in the ashes of war. And when the wind moved through the valley, soft and warm, she could almost hear his voice again. The words he had once whispered beside the fire when the world was burning. You can't pretend what's real. In that valley where the rivers met, she finally understood. Love was not meant to be easy. It was meant to be true. And in the heart of the desert, between the sky and the earth, her love had become part of both, a story carried forever by the wind.